Okay, now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. David Lisak, who we're very honoured has travelled across the big pond in between Australia and the US. And we've known David's work for some time. He's been a world leader in the issue of sexual violence against women, men and children. His research on male survivors of childhood sexual abuse has been very much pioneering work internationally. This has focused public attention and spurred new initiatives. He's the founding board member of the organisation 1 in 6, a national non-profit organisation devoted to helping men who were sexually abused as children. So it's a great pleasure to have you here today, David. Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you very much for your attention here and for inviting me. I'd like to thank the organizers who are sitting here in front of me of this symposium, and Griffith University and the governments of both Australia and Queensland for making it possible for me to be here today. And I bring you all greetings from your brothers and sisters across the Pacific, and also our gratitude for the hard work being done to confront the sexual abuse of children. And I think that hard work was exemplified by the talk we just heard. I appreciate that very much. Our focus here today is on the sexual abuse of males and of what we can and must do to help men come forward to unburden themselves of shame and guilt, a burden that was never theirs to carry, and also then to seek and get the help that they need. When it comes to our collective consciousness about male survivors of childhood sexual abuse, the landscape has changed dramatically in recent years. And I want to begin this morning with a brief reminder of some of the events that have created this change. Times really have changed, but as much as they have changed, far, far more changes on its way. In fact, I really truly believe that it's just over the horizon. Our collective awareness of the reality of male sexual victimization has broken through an ages-long barrier and has become a reality, one that is now collectively perceived. And it's about time, for a long time, and we have participated collectively in an absurd reality, which I'll illustrate with just one example. For many, many years, we had stacks of research on children who had been sexually abused, and I know that literature intimately well. And in those studies, the samples were roughly 60% female children and 40% male children. And yet, all during those many decades, when you then looked at the research literature on adults who had been sexually abused as children, the sexually abused males virtually disappeared. They had become invisible. In that literature on adults who were sexually abused as children, there were virtually no studies of men. That has changed. Today there's a still small but a growing research literature on male survivors of childhood sexual abuse. We've documented many of the long-term effects, and we have helped to clarify the unique issues that so many male survivors must grapple with in healing their wounds. And this change is and will have effects that go far beyond creating awareness about the fact of male sexual victimization and also the impact of it. This change will transform our collective definition of masculinity. For as we collectively merge the reality of a male child's suffering, of his helplessness and fear and vulnerability, with our image of the man that the child becomes, we will have fundamentally altered and in fact expanded the narrow, constricted boundaries of traditional masculinity. We will have collectively expanded masculinity to include not only power and strength, but also vulnerability and helplessness, and the grief and the sorrow that all humans must contend with in the wake of such experiences. We will understand that a man can cower in fear when a flashback sends him reeling into a terrifying past that can still pierce his present, but understand as clearly that this same man can moments later gather himself, wipe away his tears, reconnect with the present, and stand up, an act of formidable strength and courage, and yes, power. So what has been driving the increasing awareness of the reality of male sexual victimization? Is it the media? Is it government investigations? Is it the criminal justice system? Is it some ineffable evolution in our collective consciousness? I would argue that all of these are actually secondary forces. That these are forces that all respond to one primary force that has been driving the increasing awareness of the sexual victimization of boys and men. And that's men themselves. Men who are survivors of childhood sexual abuse, who have lifted off of themselves the burden of shame, the shackles of secrecy, and have broken centuries of silence. I would argue that this breaking through the wall of silence is the only way that this cultural transformation is possible, and it is the only way forward. Men coming forward publicly have blown open the doors of archdioceses around the world. Men coming forward publicly have blown open the doors of such bastions of secrecy as the Citadel, of Penn State University, and countless other institutions, including Boys Town. Men coming forward publicly have exposed individual sexual predators all over the world, and predators who have hid for decades behind walls of secrecy and collusion. Individual men, one by one, taking strength from each other. Now I'm going to get personal. I was sexually abused when I was 5 years old. And ironically, the abuse that altered my life actually began, relatively speaking, not far from here. in Indonesia, when the Japanese invaded the Dutch East Indies in 1942, they rounded up the Dutch residents, separated the men from the women and children, and put them in concentration camps. In those camps, many of the children were brutalized, sexually and physically. One of those brutalized children who survived emigrated to Canada, and after the war became my live-in babysitter and sexually brutalized me for 3 months. Just like so many sexually abused men, I was shamed and terrified into silence for decades. Silenced or not, the abuse shaped my life. I became a clinical psychologist, and wouldn't you know it, I specialized in the study of trauma and violence. And then I further specialized in what was then a research void, the impact of sexual abuse on the lives of men. And then fate caught up with me. About 6 years ago, a filmmaker named Kathy Barbini asked me to serve as a consultant on a documentary that she was planning to make about men who had been sexually abused as children. I quickly agreed, and about a year later, a man whom I had evaluated as part of my death penalty forensic work, James Thomas, was scheduled for execution in the state of North Carolina. James is a remarkable man. He is miraculously still alive. And I asked Kathy if she wanted to interview him about his sexual abuse history before he was executed. She said yes, and then she asked me to do the interview. And this was 6 days before he was scheduled for execution. In the course of what I thought was a final goodbye to James, I told him that I too had been sexually abused as a child. And of course the cameras were rolling. So when Kathy Barbini saw the footage, she immediately asked me if I would be one of the men profiled in the film. For the vast majority of male survivors, this is not an easy decision to make, and it wasn't for me. Kathy did not pressure me in any way. The pressure came solely from within. I loathed the idea of going public. It made me feel exposed, intensely vulnerable. It triggered me, and it caused and spawned nightmares. But in the end, I felt I had no choice. I believed then, as I believe even more strongly now, that the only way that we will break the back of the stigma, of the burden of shame that still throttles so many men, is by men who were abused coming forward to tell their stories. If I am to ask other men to do so, how could I not do so myself? Well, I survived the exposure and learned that I'm not diminished by my public disclosure, but rather empowered. A telling moment occurred a few years ago. I was standing in a hallway in the Pentagon, having a private conversation with a 4-star general, and there was this pause, and he said, "You were sexually abused when you were a child." And I looked him in the eye and I said, "Yes." And in that moment, I felt a palpable lifting of a lifelong burden of shame. And so 2.5 years ago, I thought, wouldn't it be great if ordinary men, survivors of childhood sexual abuse who were ready to publicly tell their stories, if they had a dignified way of doing just that. And so began the Bristlecone Project, portraits and stories of men who were sexually abused as children. It is a labor-intensive project. I travel all over North America, and eventually I will be traveling all over the world to meet with each man individually. The portraits and very condensed life stories are displayed on the Bristlecone website, and we have put up physical exhibitions in Los Angeles and in New Mexico, and many more are being scheduled. Eventually, we will have local exhibitions in many communities, focusing on survivors from those communities. These men are not only breaking down the stigma and shedding themselves of the shame that was never theirs to carry. In telling their stories, which I'm now videotaping, they are also giving us a window into what it means to endure, to cope with, and to survive childhood sexual abuse as a man. And so I want to share via the men's own voices one of the surprising, at least to me, surprising things that has been revealed through these interviews. Before I do this, I need to say a word of appreciation to a former friend of mine, Tim Hetherington. Tim was a photojournalist and filmmaker who was killed in Libya in April 2011 while documenting the uprising against Gaddafi. I knew Tim briefly, all too briefly, before his death. We had several very intense conversations about trauma and about photography. And I told him about my plans for Bristlecone, and he adamantly told me that I must videotape these interviews. I told him he was probably right, but I could not possibly manage to master the still photography and the interviews, and then on top of that, master this whole other medium of videography. And so I just proceeded doing the still photographs. And then about 3-4 months ago now, I was walking through the airport in Denver and walked into a bookstore, and there was Tim staring at me. Somebody had just published a biography of him with his photograph on the cover. And I read the biography in just a couple days, and for the next 3 months, I had dreams in which Tim came back to me and just continued that conversation, berating me for not videotaping these interviews. So he won, and I'm now videotaping the interviews. Of these 29 interviews and photo sessions that I've done so far, that I've now completed, a substantial minority of the men spontaneously described extremely intense spiritual experiences associated either directly with the sexual trauma or with the aftermath. And they've described these spiritual experiences as transformative and absolutely essential to their survival and their ultimate healing from these traumas. Now, as I said, this was something completely unexpected to me, and I've done many, many interviews over the years with male survivors, and for some reason never encountered this, and I don't know whether that was my own sort of blindness or deafness to this, or whether it is just something that wasn't there before. They tend to describe their experiences within the context of their own religious or spiritual backgrounds, although some of them have no real religious backgrounds. But there is a common denominator. They describe experiences that connect them in moments of desperation to something that is greater than themselves. And that connection is the difference between life and death. Sometimes actual physical death, and sometimes it is the death of their spirit.
He said to me, can you come and help me in the book room? Nothing shocking about it. It was just normal every day. And then it became an abnormal day. So anyway.
Who was he?
He was a teacher.
He was a teacher.
We were stacking books, and he just started, making compliments like, "Oh, your arms are really strong," and I don't know, whatever. Just sort of like innocuous things, and then it just started to get weird. So then he started to just sort of like feel me up, and then the rape began, and it got really, really bad, like really bad. I was thinking to myself. At one point, I was thinking to myself, "Fuck, this guy's gonna kill me." Like that's how bad it was. And, this young kid in this room, it was locked, and I couldn't get out. And I'm thinking, "Fuck, he's gonna kill me." Like how did that kill me? And then I split. I had this out-of-body experience, and I could see myself. So the whole place went black, and I'm just looking at my face hovering above me. If that makes sense. So I'm looking up, I don't see, like it's just black. I was in this black void, almost like floating in a void. And I could just see my face floating above me. And I know I was horizontal, wasn't. And I was saying to myself, "You're safe." Saying you're safe and you're loved. Love that I felt. It overwhelms you. It's hard to explain. The love that I feel is so overwhelming. It's just like almost, it's so overwhelming and so beautiful that it's painful, it hurts. It's the only way I can describe this is if you have a child and you see your child for the first time. Imagine the love that you feel for a child and multiply it by 1,000,000. Even now when I talk, it overwhelms me. And I know that I'm crying and it's like, but it's not out of like sadness, it's so beautiful. It's indescribable. You can't. But I have these feelings, they wash over me all the time. And they've been washing over me all the time since then.
Manasseh, as you can see, was visibly shaken when he described what was an utterly overwhelming spiritual experience. And it is an experience that remains tangibly a part of him. During the interview, he leaned forward and exclaimed to me that he could feel that love, whatever it is, and he kept saying that he couldn't really describe what it was, right now in the present, that it had never left him. And he is a completely non-religious man. He does not go to any church or affiliate with any religion. At one point, in fact, he reflected on what he'd heard from priests over the years, and he said, they just don't get it. Next up is Bo Budinsky, and he describes a transformative experience that involved no words. And Bo was somebody that I interviewed before I was videotaping, so we just have the audio.
I was sexually abused by 11 different perpetrators by the time I was 18 years old, 3 family members, businessmen in the community, and a psychiatrist who had spotted that I was in trouble and in turn took me to his office at the University of Texas Medical Branch and molested me repeatedly after that. That's where the story starts. Obviously, it created a world full of trauma, and it has not been easy. I started acting out in high school, which developed into full-blown addiction. And on several occasions I've been homeless, I've been shot at. However, a precursor to that, and probably one of the most important events in my life, when I was about 5 years old, I felt a hand touch me. And it startled me. It was in the middle of the night. And I knew it was the hand of God. And the message that I got was, but never, ever quit giving up. Just keep getting up, keep getting up, keep getting up. And one day, it will come to you why. And every time I have been homeless in a scrape, in a crack house, and all of the number of dangerous positions I've been in, that voice has always been there. And I've always gotten up. Because I'm here strictly because that hand touched me that night.
What seems salient and common between Manasseh's and Bo's accounts is a profoundly emotional connection to something, some entity, something that they experience that is beyond them. That in their moments of despair, when they have been abandoned to the brutalization of a sexual predator, they encounter what to them is indelible proof that they are not alone. Ted Cadd describes a series of spiritual experiences using the framework of his Christian faith in which he was brought up. But again, I think there is this commonality of this connection to something beyond him.
Punishment in our house was typically my mother would say, go to your room and wait for your dad, take your pants and your underwear down, bend over the bed and wait for him. And he'd come in and he would beat me with a white belt. He intended to hurt. It wasn't punishment. He just intended to hurt. When I was 5, I'd been sent to the room to get ready for him, and he came in and he raped me for the first time. Well, he wanted to keep me quiet, so he took out his .38 caliber revolver and told me what he would do with it if I ever told anybody. And that silenced me for 38 years, roughly. What I understood at that point was I was so dirty, even the dirty people didn't want me. I was contaminated, and I contaminated other people. And I really closed down at that point. Eventually found the program that we use from Open Hearts Ministry that's a 12-week session. One of my friends came up to me and he said, "What were you doing a week ago Thursday?" And I'm not really ready to get into detail with this thing. And I said, "Well, why do you ask?" And he said, "Well, God told me that you were in trouble and I should be praying for you." As I sat there, it was quiet inside. I didn't know that there was so much noise until it was gone. And then God started saying, "Okay, listen up. This is why you react the way you do here. This is why you think that. This is what's going on." And it all ties back to what happened to you as a kid. That's when I started journaling. I had to. I couldn't keep up. And because the therapists and whatever had no clue as to what to do with a man who had been sexually abused, that was my primary healing tool. The first therapist I went to was a clinical psychologist, and I gave him a book. There were a couple of women counselors that were helpful, but they had dealt with women, so they had something. One of them, I took my journal in and said, "Here's where I'm at. I'm feeling kind of stuck." And she looks at it, reads it a little bit, and said, "Well, just keep doing what you're doing." No, that's not it. So journaling really was it. When I finally started working on this abuse stuff, I went to my daughter and told her, not the details, but said, "I'm sorry because I felt like I've been distant." And she said, "But Daddy, I've always known that you love me." I don't know how. I mean, that was gift. It was pure gift.
How do you understand that, Ted, that you clearly had the capacity to love even when you weren't sure that, you could hold the love of others?
That's a question that I can't answer. In the manuals that we use for the abuse groups, at one point we asked them to look at a series of pictures of Jesus and children and say, where are you in these pictures? And there's one, I have a copy of it here, I'll show you, where Jesus is holding a child, just tight, and the child is screaming, just utter agony, and that's the only one that I could relate to. As we've cared for our granddaughter a lot, she's almost 7, when I put her down for a nap or put her down for bed, she'll roll. She will lay in my arms across my lap and fall asleep. And at one point, I was looking down at her and realized that I was doing for her what Christ was doing for that child. Just recently I've learned about the Japanese pottery repair techniques, but a piece of broken pottery is repaired with gold. And all the cracks are gold. Whatever the beauty of the piece was to begin with is just stunning with all these veins of gold running through it. And so the broken pottery that most of us would throw away becomes a thing of beauty, of great value. So I'm grateful.
Ted, as you can see, is a much more formally religious man than either Manasseh or Bo, and his experience of spirituality is expressed clearly within the parameters of his Christian beliefs and support structure. But that said, there is still a discernible commonality which I find easiest to describe as connection. Ted found connection with other people, with other survivors, through his connection to a God that is as palpable to him as my beloved wife is to me. And that connection has clearly been absolutely key to Ted, not just in his survival, but the fact that he has lived a healthy life. In fact, he has been married to his wife for 45 years. They raise kids and they have grandchildren. And it raises a question of how could someone who was savagely and brutally and sadistically abused sexually and physically by his own father, who was utterly rejected and abandoned by his mother, how could someone who endures that still have the capacity to feel love and to give love? The love that is depicted in that image of Jesus that has so captured him for decades. Jesus holding this grieving child. It's not a word, it's not a concept to Ted, it's very real. And the reality of that has clearly been of an enormous protective factor for him and probably something even beyond that. Sometimes there's simply mystery as to how an individual endures unimaginable brutality as a child and yet somehow retains a connection to some core within himself. This is Mike Skinner.
I was born in Boston, and I'm the oldest of 5 siblings. I've lost 2 of those siblings to suicide. My 2 remaining siblings will not talk to me because of my openness about the family secrets. It was both of my parents and many of their perverted friends who committed the abuse to me, sexual, physical, emotional. For myself, what I found really hard, and it's still a struggle, is they were sadistic. They enjoyed it. There was a perverse delight in almost like trying to break the spirit of the child. There's something inside of me that would not allow them to break me. But the woods were my saving grace. They were a magical place for me, and that's why I live here. I just sit out there and look at those woods. And I'd go there, and it was magical. It was a triple decker, and there were certain ways to get up, and then the rope, and the way, and then let it down. So I knew where I pounded spikes or a piece of wood to get up. So it wasn't, you just couldn't shimmy up or climb up because it was up this huge tree, and it was perfect. And I would pile rocks where I could defend myself. It was like my castle keep. So that was one of the key things for me. I felt my parents, as soon as I was old enough to know about the Nazis, I felt that they were Nazi death camp guards. That's how I likened that. That was the analogy I drew to my parents. That's how brutal they were. But reading about people who survived those camps was, how did they survive? What gave them the courage? Because I wanted to be brave like them. I didn't want to fall apart. I wanted their courage.
How did Mike know to flee to the woods? What instinct led him to build a fortress there where he could protect himself not just physically but also spiritually? How did he know that his own parents were like the Nazis? A knowledge that allowed him to take a different path from them rather than to internalize their ugliness. How did he know to seek out survivors in books who could show him the path to his own survival? Mike and Ted experienced childhood traumas that I encounter among the men that I evaluate on death rows across the United States, and yet their wounds have healed. They bear many scars, but in their core, there is health. And I would love to know before I die how that is possible. The last survivor I'm going to introduce you to this morning is not a Bristlecone volunteer. It's James Thomas. As I mentioned earlier, he lives on death row in the state of North Carolina. He's sentenced to death and likely will be executed within the next 2 years. James, or JT as he's known, is a prime example of a phenomenon that I've encountered often enough over the past 25 years that once again I have to ask, how is this possible? And the phenomenon is this. I periodically encounter men on death row who were brutalized and utterly neglected as children, who lived lives of brutality and addiction, who committed awful crimes, who then adapted to the brutality of maximum security prisons where for 10, 15, or 20 years they live in all but solitary confinement. And somehow, despite all this, they are transformed. They find quiet, they find meditation, they discover insight and self-reflection. They somehow become fully human beings, as though humanity were a seed in each of us, only waiting for the drops of water needed to take root. I met JT, I believe he was 19. He had been sentenced to death already. I'm not sure that I've met anybody who had a worse history of sexual abuse. And JT was abused in other ways as well, psychologically, physically abused. But the sexual abuse was just horrific. Started when he was 5 years old, went at least till he was 14. And I think I counted up, and really JT couldn't remember all the perpetrators, but at least a dozen to 16 perpetrators. His own stepfather, who was in some ways the worst perpetrator. I'm not nervous about seeing JT. I'm looking forward to seeing JT. I feel this is my chance to say goodbye to him.
How do you shake hands through this? So what happened when you came in here after the crime?
Wow. Through some kind of crazy, tragic means, I had done to somebody else what I wanted to do to myself. This is my total failure as a human being to have taken a life. That's hard. I don't need no more than that, believe me. It's crushing.
I think there's a lot that you could say to young men who have been sexually abused, who are running from it.
Plain and simple, I thought I was the cause.
The reason why these people were sexually abusing you.
Yeah, I thought I was the cause. It was either in something I did, something I communicated unknowingly, some kind of way. I was the trigger for them. If I could let a young man know anything, it would be just the opposite of that.
I need to be honest with you. One of the reasons, and one of the main reasons that I do this work, is that I was abused when I was a kid and went through many of the same struggles.
Thank you for sharing it. Well, we give each other strength, and that's what we do.
Yeah.
You remember, that's what I got from you. I'm passing it forward.
Yeah.
Just as a side comment, the only reason we were able to go into the prison and film JT and as I said, this was 6 days before he was scheduled to be executed, was that the warden of Central Prison in Raleigh, North Carolina, actually loves him, because JT has been doing therapy with men on death row for a decade at least, and he, apart from that humanitarian value of that, he also just helps keep the unit calm because of that. I'm going to end my talk here in the only way that seems right to me, which is with a salute to the men who have volunteered for the Bristlecone Project. These men represent all of the men who have courageously stepped forward to create a space and to open a door for their fellow survivors.
David. We've got probably about 2 or 3 minutes for any questions to David.
Thank you. How representative that is of the makeup of the group that come to you, but I did notice that it was almost exclusively Anglo-Saxon males, and I'm wondering if you've got any ideas about why you know, men of colour and other ethnic groups are not, you know, part of this, or seem to be part of this, or responding to this. I mean, I have my own theories, but I'm wondering what your thoughts might be on that.
Well, we have been acutely both aware and focused on that from the beginning. And you know, there are many, many reasons why men from you know, and I'll speak for, you know, the context of the United States, and actually even in New Mexico. New Mexico is a very large Hispanic population, very large Native American population. Other parts of the country, of course, you know, large concentrations of African American men, and it is a much bigger challenge for them to take this step. Sometimes it is because of reasons within their own community and their own sort of the culture of masculinity and other things that sort of pertain to that community. And some of it, I think, is also because frankly, you know, I'm white. I'm a middle-aged white man, and it takes something for them to trust me and to trust this process and to feel like this is a process that, you know, they are genuinely invited to be a part of. So in New Mexico, I'm sort of working on this literally one person at a time. At the video you saw of the exhibition there, this was a statewide conference in the state of New Mexico, and about 500 people came through to view the exhibition. And I had 6 actually quite intense conversations with Native Americans. And I'm hoping that that will translate over time. And I don't know how much time, into just literally by personal connection, individual men come to trust me, come to trust this process, and are willing to then participate. But I think it'll take a real effort and time. And thanks for that question. I'll repeat the question just so everybody can hear it, which was, is if I have anything to say, I guess, about how important forgiveness is to the process. I don't know. I mean, one of the things that, you know, I'm trained as a social scientist, and the reason I actually included here this sort of theme of spirituality that is because as a social scientist, I'm doing these interviews and listening to these men, and it's coming at me. And so, you know, this is something I need to reckon with, you know, what's going on here, and I'm curious. And the issue of forgiveness is similar. It has come up. And really the way it's come up is men talking about unburdening themselves of their anger. So it's not so much, I forgive that person as though somehow it's okay with me now, or you're okay with me now. It's nothing like that. It's almost like, I don't even have to think about you anymore. I am shedding this anger, so I'm freed of it. And that's how I've encountered it, which is a very different thing that a lot of people think of as of forgiveness. You know, where you're sort of like dispensing, you know, sort of, you know, it's now okay. You know, and none of the guys I've talked to have, you know, articulated that.